The first story comes from a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing bad ever really happens, until it does. It was the summer after high school, and I was house-sitting for my aunt while she was on vacation. Her house was old, creaky, filled with the kind of shadows that seem to move when you're not looking. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, the solitude, the chance to be alone with my thoughts. That night, I stayed up late watching movies, the glow of the TV the only light in the living room. The world outside was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket pressed against the windows. I was just about to head to bed when I heard it, a knock at the door. Not loud, not frantic, just a soft, steady tapping, like someone was testing to see if anyone was home. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. Who would be knocking at this hour? I checked the clock, 12:41 a.m. My heart started to race. I thought about ignoring it, pretending I was asleep, but the knocking continued, a little louder now, a little more insistent. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was a man standing on the porch, his face hidden in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, one hand raised, waiting. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, searching the darkness for any sign of movement inside. I ducked down, heart pounding, and waited. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought he'd left. I waited, counting the seconds, listening for footsteps on the gravel. But then I heard it again, this time, at the back door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing through the empty house. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had he gotten to the back so quickly? I hadn't heard him move, hadn't seen him pass the windows. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to get into the house. She told me to stay on the line, to stay quiet, to lock the doors and wait for the police. I crept to the kitchen, checking the lock on the back door. It was still secure, the deadbolt in place. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Silence. Then, a voice, soft, almost pleading. Please. Let me in. I need help. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. The voice came again, a little louder, a little more desperate. Please. I'm hurt. I need to use your phone. I could hear the tremble in his words, the edge of panic. But something about it felt wrong, too rehearsed, too controlled. I stayed silent. The police arrived 10 minutes later, lights flashing, sirens off. They searched the yard, the street, the woods behind the house. They found footprints in the mud, leading from the front porch to the back door, then disappearing into the trees. But they never found the man. The officer told me I'd done the right thing, that I should never open the door for anyone after dark, no matter what they say. He said there had been reports of break-ins in the area, people using stories of injury or car trouble to get inside. Sometimes, they just wanted money. Sometimes, it was worse. I never found out who the man was, or what he really wanted. But I still think about that night, about the way his voice sounded through the door, about the way he moved without making a sound. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd answered, if I'd let him in. I still wake up sometimes, heart racing, convinced I hear knocking in the middle of the night. That was the first time I learned the rule. Never answer the door after midnight. No matter what. The second story comes from a city that never really sleeps, where the glow of streetlights and the hum of distant traffic are a constant backdrop. But even in a place where people are always coming and going, there are moments when the world feels empty, when the only thing you can hear is your own heartbeat. That's how it was for Lena, a college student living alone for the first time in a cramped apartment on the third floor of a building that had seen better days. It was a Thursday night, and Lena was up late studying for an exam. The city outside her window was a blur of neon and headlights, but inside, everything was still. She had her headphones on, music low, the pages of her textbook illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp. She was just starting to doze off when she heard it, a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just a single, sharp rap that cut through the silence. She pulled off her headphones, listening. Nothing. She checked the clock, 12:19 a.m. Her first thought was that it was a neighbor, maybe someone locked out or in need of help. But something about the knock made her uneasy. It was too quiet, too controlled, as if whoever was on the other side was waiting for her to make the first move. She tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the elevator at the end of the corridor. She waited, heart pounding, but no one appeared. She was about to turn away when she heard it again, this time, softer, almost a whisper. Another knock, barely more than a tap. She pressed her eye to the peephole again. Still nothing. But then, as she watched, a shadow moved across the far wall, just out of sight. Someone was there, standing just beyond the frame, waiting. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She backed away from the door, grabbing her phone. She texted her friend across the hall, asking if she'd heard anything. The reply came back almost instantly, "No, but I'm coming over." Relief washed over Lena, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call, from her own number. She stared at the screen, confusion turning to fear. The phone rang once, twice, then stopped. She waited, breath held, but nothing happened. She tried to call her friend, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was gone. Then, the knocking started again. Louder this time, more insistent. Whoever was out there wanted in. Lena pressed her back against the wall, trying to stay calm. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell, about spirits that wandered the city at night, looking for someone to invite them in. She'd always laughed at those stories, but now, in the darkness, they didn't seem so funny. She heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, moving away from her door. She waited, counting the seconds, until she heard her friend's voice calling her name. She rushed to the door, relief flooding through her, but stopped just before unlocking it. Something was wrong. Her friend's voice sounded off, flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting lines from a script. "Lena, open the door. It's me. Please, let me in." Lena hesitated, her hand on the lock. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. The voice came again, a little closer, a little more urgent. "Lena, please. I need your help." But Lena knew her friend. She knew the way her voice rose when she was scared, the way she laughed when she was nervous. This voice was wrong. It was too calm, too steady. It didn't sound like her at all. She stepped back, heart racing, and texted her friend again. This time, the reply came from a different number. "I'm still in my apartment. Don't open the door." Lena stared at the door, the weight of the silence pressing in on her. The knocking stopped. The footsteps faded. She waited, breathless, until the sun began to rise and the city came back to life. She never found out who, or what, was at her door that night. But she never answered a knock after midnight again. And she never laughed at her grandmother's stories. The third story is one that's been told and retold in whispers, passed from neighbor to neighbor, each time with a new detail, a new warning. But this version comes from Mark, a night shift security guard at a warehouse on the edge of town. Mark was used to the quiet, the long hours spent walking empty corridors, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He liked the solitude, the sense of control that came with being the only one awake while the rest of the world slept. It was a Friday night, and the warehouse was especially still. Mark was making his rounds, flashlight in hand, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was locked up tight. He paused in the break room for a cup of coffee, the clock on the wall ticking past midnight. That's when he heard it, a knock at the loading dock door. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the empty building. Mark frowned. No one was supposed to be there. Deliveries didn't come until morning, and the only other guard on duty was stationed at the front gate. He set his coffee down and walked to the loading dock, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the vast, empty space. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. He reached the door and peered through the small, grimy window. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, a figure stepped into the light, a woman, her hair matted, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dirt. She looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. "Please," she said, her voice muffled by the thick metal door. "You have to let me in. Someone's after me." Mark hesitated. He'd heard stories about people using tricks to get inside, about robberies and worse. But the woman looked genuinely terrified. He reached for the intercom, pressing the button. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice steady. She glanced over her shoulder, her body tense. "I don't know. I was driving home, and my car broke down. I saw someone following me. Please, just let me in until the police come." Mark's training kicked in. He told her to wait, that he'd call the police. He reached for his radio, but all he got was static. He tried his cell phone, no signal. The woman pounded on the door, her voice rising in panic. "Please. He's coming. He's right behind me." Mark looked past her, into the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the pools of light cast by the street lamps. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. He turned back to the woman. "I can't let you in, but I'll stay here with you. I'll call for help as soon as I can." She stared at him, her eyes pleading. "Please. He's almost here." Mark shook his head, torn between caution and compassion. He watched as the woman pressed her hands against the glass, her breath fogging the window. Then, suddenly, her expression changed. Her eyes widened in terror, and she screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the warehouse. Mark spun around, searching the darkness. He saw nothing. When he turned back, the woman was gone. The only thing left was a smear of condensation on the glass, slowly fading. He waited by the door until dawn, his nerves frayed, his coffee cold. When the morning shift arrived, he told them what had happened. They checked the security cameras, but the footage showed nothing, no woman, no shadow, just Mark standing alone at the door, talking to empty air. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But he never forgot the look in the woman's eyes, the sound of her scream, the sense that something was out there in the darkness, waiting. After that night, Mark never answered a knock after midnight again. And he never worked the night shift allo. The fourth story is the one that changed everything for me. It's the reason I never answer the door after midnight, no matter how much I want to believe the world is still a safe place. It happened a few years ago, in the house where I grew up, a place that always felt warm and familiar, filled with the echoes of laughter and the comfort of routine. But all it takes is one night, one knock, to turn everything you know upside down. It was late autumn, the kind of night when the wind rattles the windows and the trees scrape their branches against the siding. My parents were out of town, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book and a mug of tea. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a knock at the front door. Not loud, not hurried, just a slow, deliberate tap. 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 I sat up, heart thudding in my chest. I checked the clock, 12:32 a.m. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a branch blown against the door, maybe a neighbor in need. But the knocking came again, steady and patient, as if whoever was out there knew I was listening. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The porch was empty, the street beyond shrouded in darkness. I waited, breath held, but saw nothing. I was about to turn away when I heard it again, this time, from the back door. The same slow, deliberate knock. Tap. 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 A cold wave of fear washed over me. I moved through the house, every light on, every shadow suddenly menacing. I checked the locks, made sure every window was closed. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, a voice, soft, almost sing-song, drifting through the mail slot. "Let me in. I know you're awake. Let me in." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but answer. The voice came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. "Let me in. I'm cold. I'm lost. Please." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed my parents, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried the police, but the line was dead, no signal, no dial tone, just static. The voice grew angry, the words twisting into something sharp and cruel. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." I ran to my room, locked the door, and hid under the covers like I was a child again. I lay there, listening to the sound of footsteps moving through the house, slow and heavy, pausing outside my door. The handle rattled, once, twice, then stopped. Silence. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking to sunlight streaming through the window. The house was quiet, the only sound the birds singing outside. I crept downstairs, every muscle tense, every sense on high alert. The front door was wide open, the wind blowing leaves across the threshold. On the porch, in the spot where I'd seen nothing the night before, was a single, muddy footprint, too large to be mine, too deep to be from the wind. I never found out who, or what, came to my door that night. But I know this: some knocks are never meant to be answered. Some voices are never meant to be let in. And some rules are written in fear, passed down from those who learned the hard way. Never answer the door after midnight. No matter what you hear. No matter who calls your name. You might think these stories are just coincidences, the kind of things that happen to other people, in other places, far from the safety of your own home. But the truth is, the world changes after midnight. The rules you trust in daylight start to bend, and the familiar becomes strange. It's easy to dismiss a knock at the door as a lost traveler, a neighbor in need, or a prank. But when you're alone, when the hour is late and the shadows are long, your instincts sharpen. You start to notice things you'd usually ignore, the way the wind seems to hush, the way the silence presses in, the way your heart beats a little faster for no reason you can name. After my own experience, I started asking around, quietly, carefully, as if I was afraid the wrong question might invite something back. I found out I wasn't alone. There were others, People who'd heard the knock, who'd felt the chill, who'd stood on the other side of the door and wondered what waited in the dark. Some of them had stories like mine, simple and strange. Others had stories that were harder to explain. One woman told me about the night she woke to the sound of someone crying outside her door. It was a child's voice, thin and desperate, begging to be let in. She almost opened the door, but something stopped her, a memory of her grandmother's warning, a sudden, unexplainable fear. She waited, listening, as the crying faded into laughter, high and cold, echoing down the empty street. In the morning, she found small, muddy handprints on the glass, and a single, perfect marble on the doormat. A man from the next town over said he'd answered the door after midnight once, years ago. He didn't remember much, just a face he couldn't quite see, a voice that sounded like his own, and a feeling of falling, endless and cold. He woke up hours later, lying on the front lawn, the door still open, his memory blank. He moved away not long after, and he never answered a late-night knock again. There were stories of people who vanished, of doors left open, of footprints that led nowhere. Stories of voices that sounded like loved ones, calling from the darkness, promising safety, begging for help. Stories of shadows that lingered on the porch, waiting for someone to make a mistake. I started to wonder if there was something about the act of answering, about the invitation itself. Maybe it wasn't about who was on the other side of the door, but about what you let in when you opened it. Maybe the real danger wasn't outside, but in the moment you decided to trust, to believe, to ignore the voice in your head that said, "Don't." I found myself double-checking the locks every night, drawing the curtains tight, leaving a light on in the hallway. I stopped listening to music late at night, stopped watching movies with the sound up, stopped doing anything that might drown out the sound of a knock. I told myself it was just caution, just common sense, but deep down, I knew it was fear. The stories stayed with me, growing in the quiet hours, filling the spaces between sleep and waking. I started to dream of doors, endless doors, each one waiting to be opened, each one hiding something I couldn't see. Sometimes, I'd wake to the sound of knocking, my heart racing, my hands shaking, convinced that someone, or something, was waiting just outside. I never answered. Not again. There's something about the hours after midnight that makes the world feel thinner, as if the distance between what's real and what isn't has shrunk to a single breath. Maybe that's why so many of these stories start the same way, a knock, a voice, a choice. It's easy to imagine yourself doing the right thing, being brave, helping someone in need. But when the moment comes, when the darkness is pressing in and the only thing between you and the unknown is a thin sheet of wood, you realize how fragile your courage really is. I started to notice patterns in the stories I collected. The knocks always came after midnight, never before. The voices were always familiar, or almost familiar, just enough to make you doubt yourself, to make you question what you know. Sometimes it was a friend, a neighbor, a child. Sometimes it was your own voice, echoing back at you from the other side of the door. And always, there was a sense of urgency, a plea for help, a reason to open up. But the people who resisted, who listened to that small, stubborn voice inside, always said the same thing: the moment they decided not to answer, the feeling changed. The fear didn't go away, but it shifted, became something colder, more distant. The knocking would stop, the voice would fade, and the night would settle back into silence. But the sense of being watched, of being chosen, lingered long after. I remember one story in particular, from a man named David. He lived alone in a farmhouse miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by fields and woods. He was used to the quiet, the isolation, the way the world seemed to shrink after dark. But one night, just after 1 in the morning, he heard a knock at the door. It was slow, deliberate, almost polite. He got out of bed, grabbed his shotgun, and crept to the door. Through the peephole, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, a voice, soft, familiar, calling his name. It was his brother's voice, but David's brother had died years before. The voice pleaded with him, begged to be let in, said it was cold, said it was lost. David stood there, frozen, listening as the voice grew more desperate, more insistent, until it was screaming, pounding on the door, shaking the frame. He never opened the door. He never saw what was on the other side. But in the morning, he found the ground outside covered in frost, except for a single, perfect handprint on the porch, long, thin fingers pressed into the wood, already fading in the light. Stories like David's made me wonder about the things we can't explain, the rules we follow without knowing why. Maybe there's a reason every culture has its own version of the midnight visitor, its own warnings about doors and thresholds and the dangers of the dark. Maybe the stories are older than we think, passed down from a time when the world was wilder, when the night was full of things that waited for us to make a mistake. I started to see the world differently. Every knock, every voice, every shadow became a question, a test. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the fear that kept me safe. I learned that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all. And I learned that some doors are better left closed. As the months went by, the stories I'd heard began to change the way I lived. I found myself growing more cautious, more aware of the world after dark. I started to notice things I'd never paid attention to before, the way the wind seemed to hush just before midnight, the way the shadows in the hallway stretched a little longer, the way my own reflection sometimes looked back at me with a question I couldn't answer. I wasn't alone in this. The people I'd spoken to, the ones who'd shared their stories, all described the same feeling, a sense that something was waiting, just out of sight, just beyond the door. I began to wonder if the act of not answering, of refusing the invitation, was what kept us safe. Maybe the danger wasn't in the knock itself, but in the moment you decided to trust, to open up, to let something in. Maybe the stories were warnings, not just about the world outside, but about the choices we make when we're afraid. One night, I got a call from Lena, the college student from the second story. She sounded shaken, her voice thin and tight. She told me she'd heard the knocking again, weeks after that first night. This time, it was even softer, almost gentle, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there knew she was listening. She didn't answer, didn't move, just lay in bed with the covers pulled up to her chin, waiting for the dawn. When she finally got up the courage to look through the peephole, she saw a single white flower on the doormat, its petals perfectly arranged, untouched by the wind. She asked me if I thought it meant something, if it was a sign that she'd done the right thing. I told her I didn't know, but I believed she was safe as long as she kept the door closed. We talked for a long time, sharing stories, comforting each other with the knowledge that we weren't alone. When we hung up, I felt a little lighter, a little less afraid. But the fear never really goes away. It just changes shape, becomes part of the background noise of your life. You learn to live with it, to respect it, to let it guide you when the world feels uncertain. You learn to trust your instincts, to listen to the voice that says, "Wait. Don't open the door. Not yet." I started keeping a journal, writing down every strange thing that happened, every story I heard, every detail that seemed important. The more I wrote, the more I realized how many people had stories like mine, stories of knocks in the night, of voices that sounded almost right, of choices that haunted them long after the danger had passed. Some of them had answers, explanations that made sense in the light of day. But most didn't. Most were just questions, left hanging in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that night, or what waits on the other side of the door. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the wind, or a lost traveler, or a neighbor in need. But maybe, just maybe, it's something else, something older, something patient, something that knows how to wait. And so I keep the rule. I never answer the door after midnight. I never let my guard down, never ignore the feeling that something is watching. I tell myself it's just caution, just common sense. But deep down, I know it's more than that. It's survival. There are nights when I lie awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the porch or the soft, deliberate knock that signals the start of another story. Sometimes I wonder if the stories I've collected have changed me, if I've become someone who sees danger in every shadow, who trusts no one after the clock strikes 12. But then I remember the voices I've heard, the fear in the eyes of the people who've shared their experiences, the way the world feels different after midnight. It's not paranoia, it's caution, born from the knowledge that some things can't be explained, and some risks aren't worth taking. I think about Mark, the security guard, and how he never worked the night shift alone again. I think about Lena, who still keeps a white flower pressed between the pages of her journal, a reminder that she made the right choice. I think about the woman who heard a child crying outside her door, and the man who saw his own face on the other side of the peephole. I think about myself, standing in the hallway of my childhood home, listening to a voice that sounded almost human, almost kind, almost safe. The stories have a way of weaving themselves into your life, changing the way you see the world. You start to notice the little things, the way the air feels heavier after midnight, the way the shadows seem to move when you're not looking, the way your own reflection sometimes lingers a moment too long. You learn to trust your instincts, to listen to the voice that says, "Wait. Don't open the door. Not yet." Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd answered the door that night. Would I have found a lost traveler, a neighbor in need, or something else entirely? Would I have become another story, another warning whispered in the dark? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left closed. I've come to believe that the world is full of thresholds, places where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet, where the rules change and the familiar becomes strange. The front door after midnight is one of those thresholds, a line you cross at your own risk. Maybe that's why the stories are so powerful, why they linger long after the danger has passed. They remind us that we're vulnerable, that we're not as safe as we think, that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine. But they also remind us that we have a choice. We can listen to the warnings, trust our instincts, and keep ourselves safe. We can learn from the stories of others, and add our own to the growing collection of cautionary tales. We can choose to keep the door closed, to wait for the dawn, to believe that sometimes, doing nothing is the bravest thing of all. So if you ever find yourself awake after midnight, listening to the silence, and you hear a knock at the door, remember these stories. Remember the fear, the uncertainty, the relief that comes with making the right choice. Remember that you're not alone, that others have stood where you stand, that the world is full of people who know what it means to be afraid. And above all, remember the rule: never answer the door after midnight. No matter what. Sometimes, I wonder if the rule is more than just superstition, if it's a kind of ancient wisdom, passed down through generations, a survival instinct that's been encoded in us since the days when the night was full of real dangers. Maybe the stories we tell are a way of keeping that wisdom alive, a way of reminding ourselves and each other that the world is not always as safe as it seems. Maybe the knocks at the door after midnight are just tests, reminders that we're still vulnerable, still human, still capable of fear. I've read about cultures all over the world that have their own versions of this rule. In some places, it's said that spirits wander after midnight, looking for an invitation. In others, it's believed that evil can only enter if you open the door and let it in. There are stories of shapeshifters, of lost souls, of things that wear the faces of people you love. The details change, but the warning is always the same: don't answer. Don't invite the unknown into your home. I think about the people who didn't listen, the ones whose stories end in mystery or tragedy. The man who woke up on his lawn with no memory of the night before. The woman who found marbles and muddy handprints on her porch. The security guard who saw a terrified woman vanish into thin air. The footprints, the flowers, the voices that sound almost right. Each story is a thread, weaving a tapestry of caution that stretches across time and place. But there are other stories, too, stories of people who listened to their instincts, who kept the door closed, who waited for the dawn. They're the ones who live to tell the tale, who pass the warning on to others. They're the reason the rule survives, the reason we still hesitate when we hear a knock in the dark. I've started to see the rule as a kind of comfort, a way of taking control in a world that can feel unpredictable and frightening. It's a small act of defiance, a way of saying, not tonight. Not here. Not me. It's a reminder that we have power, even in the face of the unknown. That we can choose safety, choose caution, choose to trust ourselves. The stories have changed me. I'm more careful now, more aware of the boundaries between myself and the world outside. I lock my doors, draw my curtains, keep a light on in the hallway. I listen to the silence, and I trust the fear that rises in my chest when the clock strikes 12. I know that fear is not weakness, it's wisdom, hard-earned and well-deserved. And I keep telling the stories, because I know there are others out there who need to hear them. Others who have stood on the other side of the door, heart pounding, breath held, waiting for the night to pass. Others who have learned, as I have, that some rules are worth keeping, no matter how old you get. So if you ever find yourself alone after midnight, listening to the silence, and you hear a knock at the door, remember these stories. Remember the rule. And remember that you're not alone. There's a strange comfort in knowing you're not the only one who's ever been afraid. Fear connects us, even when we're alone in the dark, even when the world outside our door feels impossibly far away. The stories I've shared aren't just warnings, they're reminders that we all have moments when we're vulnerable, when we have to make choices that might seem small but could change everything. They're proof that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all. I think about the people who've reached out to me since I started collecting these stories. Some just wanted to share their own experiences, to unburden themselves of memories that wouldn't let them sleep. Others wanted reassurance, a voice on the other end of the line to tell them they'd done the right thing. A few just wanted to know they weren't crazy, that the things they'd seen and heard weren't just tricks of the mind. I listened to them all, and in every story, I heard the same thread of fear, the same moment of decision, the same relief, or regret, that followed. It's easy to feel isolated when you're afraid, to believe that you're the only one who's ever faced the unknown. But the truth is, we're all connected by the stories we tell, by the rules we keep, by the choices we make in the dark. Every time someone chooses not to answer the door after midnight, they're adding another link to a chain that stretches back through time, a chain that binds us together in the face of things we can't explain. I've learned that fear isn't something to be ashamed of. It's a signal, a warning, a way of keeping ourselves safe. It's what kept Lena from opening the door, what kept Mark from letting the woman inside, what kept me from answering the voice that called my name. It's what keeps the stories alive, what keeps the rule in place, what keeps us all just a little bit safer. But fear can also be a teacher. It can show us where our boundaries are, where our courage begins and ends. It can remind us that we're stronger than we think, that we can survive the night, that we can make it to the dawn. It can help us find each other, in the darkness and the silence, and remind us that we're never truly alone. So if you ever find yourself standing on the other side of a door after midnight, listening to a voice that sounds almost right, remember the stories you've heard. Remember the people who made the choice to wait, to trust their instincts, to keep themselves safe. Remember that you have the power to do the same. And if you ever need a reminder, if you ever need to hear another story, you know where to find me. I'll be here, keeping the light on, listening for the next knock, ready to share another tale of caution and courage. Because the world is full of stories, and some of them are meant to keep us safe.